The girl who used to knock my lunch tray onto the cafeteria floor for 4 straight years had just become my roommate, and she couldn't stop looking at me like she'd never seen me before in her life. I stood in the doorway of apartment 4B with a duffel bag digging into my shoulder and a dented thermos in my hand, and Sloane Kestrel stood on the other side of it in sock feet, staring at me the way you'd stare at a bill you didn't remember signing. Neither of us said anything for 11 seconds. I counted them. To understand how I ended up on that threshold, I have to go back 4 days, to the morning the housing office called to tell me my old building had failed its final inspection, and I had 18 hours to find somewhere else to live. Subscribe to the channel, and I'll tell you the rest. My name is Ren Calloway. I was 23, an Omega, a fifth-year architecture major on a scholarship that covered tuition and nothing resembling food, and I had exactly $412 in a checking account that needed to last me until the semester's final stipend cleared. The housing office woman on the phone was apologetic in the specific, useless way of someone reading from a script. There was one opening left in the entire university system, she said, a 2-bedroom off Linden Street. The current tenant had requested an anonymous match through the general pool instead of picking a roommate herself, which was unusual enough that the woman mentioned it twice. Like it was supposed to reassure me. I didn't ask the tenant's name. I didn't think to. I had a thesis model half built in a studio that closed at midnight, a 6 a.m. shift at the bakery on Arbor, and no room left in my head for anything but logistics. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The bakery job was the kind of work that used my hands and none of my mind, which was exactly why I kept it. My real work happened after hours, in the design studio, where I built load-bearing structures out of basswood and glue and the kind of obsessive attention nobody had ever paid to me. I had one gift, and it wasn't beauty and it wasn't charm. It was that I could look at a structure and see where it would fail before it failed. I'd been able to do it since I was a kid stacking cans in my aunt's pantry, watching for the shelf that would give first. My Aunt Dana called it a curse. My professors called it, when they bothered to notice me at all, a useful eye. I called it the only thing about me nobody had managed to take. I hadn't always been invisible. In high school, I'd been the opposite of invisible. I'd been a target, which is its own kind of visibility, the kind that leaves marks. 4 years at Bellwether Prep, and for 3 of them, the person who made sure I never forgot what I was worth had been Sloane Kestrel. She hadn't done it alone. She'd had a court, the way girls like her always do, and Portia Vance had been the loudest of them, but Sloane had been the center of gravity. Sloane didn't yell. She didn't need to. She had a way of looking through a person that did more damage than any insult, and she'd perfected it on me somewhere around sophomore year, right after I made the mistake of winning a design prize she thought should have gone to one of her friends. My portfolio ended up face down in a puddle outside the art building a week later. Nobody ever proved who'd done it. I never had to be told. She'd knocked my thermos out of my hands in the cafeteria the week before graduation, for no reason I ever understood, and it had dented on the tile and rolled under a table, and I'd crawled after it while half the room watched. I still had that thermos. I don't know why. Some griefs you keep because setting them down feels like losing the argument. So when I climbed 3 flights of stairs on Linden Street with everything I owned split between 2 bags and knocked on the door of 4B, and it opened on Sloane Kestrel in a gray t-shirt with her hair loose for the first time I'd ever seen it loose, my first thought wasn't fear. It was a strange, flat disbelief, the kind that arrives before the feeling that's actually supposed to be there. "You have got to be kidding me," she said. "I was told this was my apartment," I said. Apparently, I was told wrong. Her eyes moved over me once, fast, cataloging, Then something in her face did a thing I didn't have a word for yet, a kind of falling still, like a building settling after a long-held breath. She stepped back from the door. "It's your apartment," she said. "Housing office doesn't know who you are. I didn't put your name on the request. You put in for an anonymous roommate." I put in for anyone who wasn't my mother's idea of a suitable placement. Her mouth did something close to a smile, and it looked unpracticed, like a muscle she hadn't used in years. The universe has a sense of humor I did not order. I should have turned around. I had $400 and nowhere else to sleep, and I stood there weighing the arithmetic of my own dignity against my own rent. And dignity lost, the way it usually does when you're the one paying the bills. I stepped inside. The apartment smelled like clove and riverstone, cold and faintly metallic, a scent I would have known blind in a crowd of 1,000 people because it had haunted the back half of my adolescence the way a bruise haunts the spot you keep pressing to check if it still hurts. It still hurt. I filed that away and said nothing. "There's a room at the end," she said. "It's small. I wasn't expecting anyone to actually take it. I don't need much." "No," she said, quiet enough that I almost missed it. "I don't imagine you do." I didn't understand yet what was underneath that sentence. I only knew that she was watching me cross her living room the way you watch a door you're not sure will hold, and that the last time Sloane Kestrel had looked at me like I mattered even a little, it had ended with my things face down in the mud. The room at the end of the hall was small enough that the bed took up half of it, but it had a window that faced east, and I stood there for a long moment after she left, listening to her move around the apartment on the other side of the wall, feeling my whole understanding of the last decade rearrange itself around one impossible fact. I was going to live with her. I was going to see her every morning, and some traitor part of my chest, some part I would have denied under oath, had noticed that her eyes had not once, not for a second, looked at me like I was background noise. That was new. I didn't know yet what it meant. I only knew that for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, someone had looked at me like I was the thing worth looking at. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay on a mattress that wasn't mine, in a room that smelled faintly of paint and someone else's laundry detergent, and listened to the apartment breathe around me, water running, a door easing shut, silence stretching out until it had a texture. Around 2 a.m, I got up for water and found Sloane at the kitchen counter, still awake, staring at her phone like it had personally offended her. "Can't sleep either," she said. It wasn't a question. "New place," I said. "Old ghosts." Something flickered across her face. She didn't ask what I meant. I think she already knew. We didn't talk much that week. We orbited each other in the small apartment the way strangers do, careful, over-polite, apologizing for using the shower first. I cataloged her the way I cataloged everything. Structurally, the tailored coat that cost more than my semester, the black car that idled outside some mornings with a driver who called her Miss Kestrel, the calls she took on the balcony with her voice dropped into a register I hadn't heard since high school, clipped, commanding, nothing like the quiet person leaving her socks by the door. Wealth, on her, wasn't loud. It was in the weight of the door hinges, the brand of coffee she never mentioned buying, the way the building super called her by name like she paid for something the rest of us didn't. I learned, from an overheard call, that she wasn't supposed to be living in an apartment like this at all. I learned it from 3 sentences through a cracked door, her voice low and furious. Something about a trust, something about her father's condition. A year of ordinary life, unmonitored, unassisted, or the company stayed in her mother's hands past the date it was supposed to transfer. I didn't understand all of it. I understood enough. I came home from the bakery on a Thursday, hands raw from the oven racks, and found a paper bag on the counter with the ingredients for my grandmother's ginger tea cakes. The exact ones: cardamom and black pepper and molasses in the old ratio, sitting beside a note in handwriting I didn't recognize yet as hers. I mentioned this recipe exactly once in a 10th grade home ec class, 3 feet from Sloane's lab table, to a friend who has long since stopped speaking to me. She'd been listening. She'd been listening for 8 years. I didn't say anything about it. I made the tea cakes that night and left half of them on a plate on the counter, and in the morning the plate was empty and washed and set to dry, and neither of us ever mentioned it. It became its own kind of language. We didn't trust our mouths yet. Our hands went first. The friction came in from outside soon enough. Portia Vance was in my structures seminar, a discovery I made the same week I discovered she'd transferred into the architecture program's dual degree track, apparently on her father's insistence that a business minor needed an artistic complement. She found me at a pinup review, my model for the Kestrel Prize competition sitting, exposed on a table for critique. And she looked at it the way she used to look at my portfolio in the mud. "Still building little houses," she said. "Cute. Does Sloane know you moved into her spare room, or did you just wait until she wasn't looking?" "She knows my name," I said. "That's further than most people in this building ever got. She knows everyone's name. It's called manners." Portia's smile had teeth in it, had always had teeth in it. "Don't confuse charity for anything else. Sloane doesn't do anything without a reason. You should ask yourself what hers is." I didn't have an answer for that. I went home that night and found Sloane at the kitchen table with a set of my structural drawings spread in front of her, ones I hadn't shown anyone, ones I'd left on the counter half-finished. She didn't apologize for looking. She traced a line along one of my load calculations with a finger that stopped exactly where the weakness in the design was, the flaw I hadn't fixed yet. "This joint won't hold," she said. "Under lateral load, it'll shear before it bends." I stared at her. "How do you know that? My family built half the skyline in this state before I could read." She looked up, and for once there was nothing careful in her face. I know a failure point when I see one. I didn't know then that she wasn't only talking about the drawing. I only knew that when our hands both reached for the same pencil a second later and touched, something in my chest did the thing it hadn't done in 8 years, the thing I'd promised myself would never happen again for her specifically. It warmed. 3 days later, her phone buzzed at 7 in the morning with a name I hadn't seen yet. Mother. Her whole face changed before she'd even answered it, went smooth and careful and far away, like a door closing from the inside. She took the call on the balcony. When she came back in, she wouldn't look at me. "I have to go home this weekend," she said. "Family obligation." "Everything okay?" "No," she said. And it was the most honest thing she'd said to me since I'd walked through that door. "But it will be handled. It's what my family does. We handle things." I didn't know yet what needed handling, or that the something waiting for her at home wore her mother's face and had been rehearsing this conversation for 8 years, ever since another daughter had died in a house too proud to call for outside help in time. The Kestrel Prize, I discovered the following week, was not simply a school competition. It was funded, judged, and named for a firm whose logo I'd walked past on a downtown tower 100 times, without ever once connecting it to the woman leaving damp towels on our bathroom floor. Sloane Kestrel wasn't Sloane who happened to have money. She was the Kestrel, heir to a construction empire that had a hand in half the skyline I'd been sketching since I was 12, and I found this out not from her, but from a program email listing the judging panel for the year's thesis prize, her full legal name, printed in a serif font between two men I'd only ever seen in magazines. I confronted her about it that night, standing in the kitchen with the printed email shaking slightly in my hand, more from the shock of it than from anger, though anger was in there too, curled up tight. "You're judging my thesis." "I recused myself the day the housing office put your name on the lease," she said. "I told the panel I had a conflict. You didn't think to mention it before I found out from an email? I didn't think you'd want to hear it from me," she said. And there was something raw underneath the words, something that made me stop mid-breath. "Everything I say to you comes with 8 years of reasons not to believe me." I didn't want to add one more. I didn't have an answer for that either. I was still holding it, the shape of that sentence, when the buzzer rang and a woman I would come to know as Vivienne Kestrel let herself into our apartment like she owned the building, because, as it turned out, she did. She was tall the way Sloane was tall, cold the way Sloane could be cold when she let herself, except there was no warmth underneath Vivienne's version. No banked fire waiting for permission. Her eyes went over our apartment, over the ginger tea cakes still cooling on the counter, over me, and did not warm by a single degree. "So this is her," Vivienne said, not to me, to Sloane. "I was told you'd taken in a roommate. I wasn't told she was an Omega with a bakery job and a scholarship. Her name is Wren," Sloane said. Her voice had gone flat, controlled. The voice I remembered from the hallways at Bellwether. "I know whose name it is." Vivienne's gaze cut back to me, and I felt it land somewhere under my sternum, cold as the scent she carried, iron and old rain. "I've met her before. She was in Ivy's grade." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sloane's whole body went still in a way I'd never seen, not once, not in 8 years of watching her from a careful distance. "Don't," Sloane said. "I'm only stating a fact." Vivienne's mouth curved, not into a smile. "Some people are disposable. Sloane, I have spent your whole life trying to teach you the difference between the ones worth keeping and the ones who cost you everything to love. I would have thought, after your sister, the lesson would have stuck." I stood in my own kitchen and felt 8 years of scar tissue split open at once, and Sloane, who had spent a week feeding me my grandmother's recipes and tracing my drawings and looking at me like I was something worth building toward, said nothing. Not one word. She stood there with her jaw locked and her hands in fists at her sides, and the silence stretched long enough that I understood, with the particular clarity of an old wound reopening, exactly how much power that woman still had over her. I went to my room and shut the door before either of them could see my face. The storm hit 2 nights later. A real one. The kind that knocked the power out across half the district and left the studio building running on emergency lighting when I stayed too late finishing joinery on my model. I heard the wood groan before I saw it happen, my central support beam splitting where a classmate had over-tightened a clamp hours earlier, and I lunged for the collapsing structure on instinct. Catching the weight of it against my forearm as a support strut came down and opened a gash from wrist to elbow. Blood everywhere, model half saved, my hand shaking too hard to hold pressure on it properly. Sloane found me 40 minutes later because I hadn't answered 3 texts and she had apparently decided that was enough of a reason to walk 11 blocks in the storm. She didn't ask permission before she took my arm in both hands and pressed a clean cloth against the wound, kneeling on the studio floor in a soaked coat, her scent gone sharp and worried, clove and struck stone with something underneath it I hadn't smelled on her before. Fear. "You should be at a hospital," she said. "It's not that deep. Wren," my name in her mouth still did something to me I hadn't fully forgiven myself for. "You could have lost the whole model. You could have lost your arm." I wasn't going to let it fall. My voice cracked on the last word, not from the pain. I don't. I don't let things fall. It's the one thing I'm good at. She looked up at me then, kneeling in the wreckage of my thesis, blood on her hands that weren't even hers, and something in her face broke open the way I'd never once seen it break in 8 years of watching from across a cafeteria. I remember everything about high school, she said, every single thing I did. I have never once forgotten a moment of it. And I need you to understand that before this goes any further, because you deserve to walk away right now if you want to. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't keep touching your bandages and pretending it's just first aid. Her thumb moved once, gentle, along the inside of my wrist, above the cut, where my pulse was going fast enough that she had to feel it. Tell me to stop, and I will. I need you to say it out loud if that's what you want, because I don't trust myself to read it any other way. I didn't tell her to stop. I didn't say anything at all, because the studio door banged open behind us, a night custodian sweeping the storm's debris off the front steps, and the moment folded itself closed before either of us could finish it. She drove me to urgent care instead, held my good hand in the waiting room, and didn't let go until they called my name. We didn't talk about the studio floor for 3 days. Then, on a night when the power was still flickering across half the block and the apartment ran on candlelight and a single battery lantern, Sloane sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me about her sister. Ivy had been born 9 minutes after Sloane, an omega where Sloane was an alpha, gentle where Sloane was already, even at 6 years old, being drilled in posture and command by a mother who considered softness a structural flaw in her own children. Ivy had gone into her first heat at 14 with complications nobody caught in time because their mother didn't trust outside doctors, because the family had always handled its own, because admitting Ivy needed help outside the house would have meant admitting the house had failed. By the time anyone called for real care, it was sepsis. Sloane had been in the room. She had been 15 years old, and she had watched her twin stop being able to answer her, and she had never once, in the 8 years since, stopped hearing the silence where Ivy's voice used to be. You were quiet the way she was quiet, Sloane said, staring at the candle instead of at me. Not weak. Never weak, just quiet in a way the world doesn't reward, and it undid something in me every time I looked at you, because I couldn't save her, and I didn't know what to do with a version of her walking around a school hallway like nothing had happened. So I made you into someone I could hate instead of someone I'd already lost. It wasn't fair. It wasn't close to fair. I don't have a version of this where I get to call it anything other than what it was. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling old scar tissue and new understanding try to occupy the same space. That doesn't make it okay, I know. But I believe you, I said, surprising myself. I believe every word of it. I told her, after that, about my own scars. The ones that had nothing to do with her, my parents, who had stopped calling after I presented Omega at 15, who had wanted a different kind of daughter and made no secret of it, my Aunt Donna, who had taken me in without hesitation and worked 2 jobs to keep me fed, the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in every room and the least seen. Sloane listened the way she watched a structure, completely, like she was memorizing where every weight-bearing beam sat. We cooked together that night, badly, her hands useless with a whisk in a way that made me laugh for the first time in weeks, real laughter, the kind that startled us both. It was good. It was warm. It lasted exactly until my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a photograph attached, my structural drawings from the studio table with a red circle drawn around a section that looked, at a glance, identical to a published design from 3 years prior. The message underneath read, "The review board would love to see this. tomorrow, 10 a.m., or I show them myself. The review board convened at 10 the next morning, in the same hall where I'd presented 100 small critiques over 5 years, except this time the room was full, faculty and visiting judges and half my cohort, and Portia Vance stood at the back with her arms folded and an expression I recognized from a cafeteria 8 years gone. She'd found an old published pavilion design with a similar roofline to my thesis, cropped the comparison to hide every structural difference that made mine my own, and circulated it to enough faculty that the panel chair opened the session by asking me, in front of everyone, to explain the similarities before we proceeded. I stood there with my model on the table and my whole 5 years of work reduced to a question about whether I'd stolen it, and I looked for Sloane in the crowd and didn't find her. She'd left before I woke, a note on the counter about an urgent call from the office, gone before I could tell her what was happening. I answered the panel's questions with my voice shaking, walked them through my load calculations, my design process, the sketchbooks going back 2 years that proved every decision was mine, and it wasn't enough. Not against a rumor already halfway around the room, not against faces that had already decided what they believed before I opened my mouth. I packed that night. I told myself it was about the review, about needing space to breathe, but underneath it was a simpler, uglier truth. She hadn't been there. 8 years of learning not to expect anyone to stand where I needed them standing, and for one soft, stupid week I had let myself believe this time might be different, and then the first real test had come, and she'd vanished to handle a phone call instead. I folded my clothes into the duffel bag I'd arrived with, set the dented thermos on top, and sat on the stripped mattress in the small room with the east-facing window, and let myself believe, one more time, that I had always been something people left rather than something people stayed for. She found me there at 11 that night, breathless, like she'd run the last 3 blocks. Ren, look at me. My mother called the panel chair. She's the one who fed Portia that comparison. She's had someone watching your files since the night she found out you lived here, and I have spent the last 14 hours getting the metadata off your original drawing files pulled and time-stamped by an outside forensic firm because I wasn't going to let you fight this with nothing but your own word against theirs. You could have told me where you were going. I could have, she said. I was so afraid that if I stopped moving for 1 second, I wouldn't have anything to bring back to you. I am done letting the people I love find out I care about them after it's too late to matter. I am not doing that again. Not with you. I stood very still, holding the thermos in both hands, feeling 8 years of armor try to decide whether to hold. Your mother tried to destroy my degree. I know. Something in her face went hard in a way I hadn't seen since the day her mother had stood in our kitchen and called me disposable. And I told her, an hour ago, standing in her own office, that if she touches another file of yours, I will resign from every board seat with my name on it and take my father's 41% with me. She has spent 8 years teaching me that love is a liability. I would rather lose the whole company than prove her right one more time. I didn't unpack that night, not exactly, but I didn't leave either. I sat with her on the floor of that stripped little room until 3 in the morning, my head on her shoulder, her hand tracing slow circles against my back, both of us saying nothing at all. Because for once, nothing needed to be said out loud to be believed. The forensic report cleared me by the following afternoon, timestamps going back 19 months, every draft of my thesis logged and dated in a chain no one could argue with, and the panel scheduled a public correction for the same review hall where I'd been accused, because that was the condition Sloane's lawyer had insisted on in writing. I stood at the same table with the same model, Except this time, Portia Vance sat in the third row, with her hands white-knuckled in her lap while the panel chair read the findings aloud. The comparison images doctored, the original source manipulated, the anonymous tip traced to a university email address registered to Portia Vance herself. Portia didn't wait to be asked before she stood, chair scraping loud in the silent room. "You have no idea what it's like," she said, voice cracking, aimed at Sloane more than at me, watching you choose her. "I have spent 3 years trying to be the person you looked at like that. I did something ugly, I know that. But you made me ugly first. Every single time you looked through me like I wasn't in the room." She was still talking when 2 administrators walked her out, her academic standing suspended pending a formal misconduct hearing, her name already circulating through a department that did not forgive doctored evidence easily. I felt something in me want to enjoy it. The sight of a former tormentor finally facing a room the way she'd once made me face one. And then I caught Sloane's expression, hard and cold and already halfway to something worse, and I put my hand over hers on the table. "That's enough," I said. "Don't become your mother to punish someone who tried to become you." Something in Sloane's shoulders came down. She nodded, once, and let it go. Vivienne Kestrel was in the room too, seated near the back in a coat that cost more than the whole review hall's furniture, and when the panel chair finished reading the findings, she rose without a word and left before anyone could address her directly. She didn't apologize. I didn't expect her to, not that day. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the department on Kestrel Holdings stationery, formally withdrawing Vivienne Kestrel from all future involvement with the firm's academic sponsorships, her name replaced on every board with her husband's and, beneath his, Sloane's. The company's grip on my future review committees loosened out of her hands entirely. It wasn't an apology. It was, I would come to understand, the only kind of consequence a woman like that could be made to feel. That night, back in an apartment that finally felt like it belonged to both of us, Sloane knelt in front of me on the kitchen floor, exactly where she'd knelt with a cloth pressed to my bleeding arm weeks before, and took both my hands in hers. "Tell me if this is too fast," she said. "Tell me if any part of this frightens you, and I will slow down until it doesn't. It doesn't frighten me." My pulse was loud enough that I was certain she could hear it. "I want this. I want you. Say the rest." "Ask me with your words then," she said, "because I need to hear you say it before I let myself have it." "I'm asking," I said. "Claim me." Her mouth found my scent gland with a gentleness that undid every hard year between us, and when her teeth finally broke skin, careful, deliberate, asked for, and given twice over, the bond opened between us like a window thrown wide after a decade shut. I felt her, all of her, grief and fear and 8 years of armor dissolving into something warm enough to live in. She felt me back. Neither of us was invisible to the other. Not anymore. Not ever again. 6 months later, the pavilion I designed for my thesis broke ground on a stretch of city parkland Kestrel Holdings had donated for exactly that purpose, my name on the plaque beside hers, load-bearing joints exactly as I'd drawn them, holding. A year on, Sloane knelt again, this time in the unfinished frame of that same pavilion at golden hour, a small box in her palm instead of a cloth bandage, and asked me to marry her in front of Aunt Donna, Rosalind the Kestrel family's longtime estate manager who had known Sloane since she was 9 and cried harder than anyone at the sight of her waiting, actually waiting, for someone else's answer. And even Vivienne, seated stiffly at the edge of the gathering with a pressed flower from Ivy's old garden tucked into a small frame she left, wordless, on the gift table before she left early. It wasn't forgiveness, it was a start, and I decided that was allowed to be enough. We bonded fully at the wedding that autumn, short vows spoken under a roof I'd engineered myself. Sloane's promise echoing the one she'd made me on a studio floor with blood on both our hands. I will not let you fall, and I will not let go first. My vow to her was simpler. I told her I had spent my whole life being the thing people overlooked, and that she was the first person who had ever looked long enough to see what was actually there. On our first morning as a bonded pair, I found a new thermos on the kitchen counter, identical to the dented one I'd carried since I was a girl, except this one was whole and engraved along the base in small, careful letters for the one thing that never broke. Beside it sat a first edition atlas of bridges I'd mentioned once, years ago, in a school assignment neither of us should have remembered, and a folded itinerary for a coastline I had told her, half joking, I'd never seen. She remembered everything. She always had. It had simply taken both of us a long time to understand that being remembered, completely, by the right person was the same thing as finally being safe. I used to believe invisibility was a permanent condition, something you were born into and stayed inside of no matter how hard you built. I know better now. The people who see you clearly were never the ones standing closest. They were only ever the ones brave enough to finally look. The end. If any part of Wren and Sloane's story found something true in you, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. I'd love to know in the comments which moment hit hardest for you. The ginger tea cakes on the counter, the studio floor with blood on both their hands, or the morning she finally saw that thermos made whole again. Thank you for staying until the very last page of this one. Come back soon, because there's another story waiting, and somewhere in it, someone else is about to be seen for the very first time.